Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, What's New and What's Changed in the 2015 to 2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. This General Mills Bell Institute of Health and Nutrition is happy to be partnering with our General Mills Food Service Division to bring you this webinar. I'm delighted that so many of you, ranging from registered dietitian nutritionists to certified dietary managers, food service operators, chefs, and other health influencers have registered to join us today. My name is Kathy Weimer, a registered dietitian and senior fellow at the General Mills Bell Institute of Health and Nutrition, and I will be your host for today's webinar. For those of you not familiar with the Bell Institute of Health and Nutrition, we are a team of food and nutrition experts within General Mills whose mission is to be the source of health, nutrition, and wellness expertise that creates value and growth for General Mills. We believe food should make us better, so we work hard to make food people love while improving the nutrition of our products. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation by typing them into the lower left-hand corner of the conference webinar screen. Our presenters will answer your questions at the end of the webinar. Following the presentations, you will receive an email with your CEU certificate attached along with a link to the presentation deck. Please note that only one credit will be provided per registered attendee that is logged into the webinar. And now, it's my pleasure to introduce today's distinguished presenters. Our first speaker, Dr. Joanne Slavin, is a professor in the Department of Food Science and Nutrition at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Slavin teaches hundreds of students yearly in advanced human nutrition and has presented more than 400 invited scientific lectures around the world on topics that include carbohydrates, dietary fiber, whole grains, and the role of diet in disease prevention. Joanne is the author of more than 250 scientific publications and was a member of the 2010 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee for the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Department of Health and Human Services. Joanne has a BS, MS, and PhD degrees in nutrition science and is a registered dietitian. Our second speaker, Dr. Chris Moore, earned a BS and MS in nutrition, became a registered dietitian, and earned a PhD in exercise physiology. Now an internationally known nutrition expert, he has presented around the world from Thailand to Iceland, Singapore to Turkey, and many countries in between. As a nutrition consultant, he works with a variety of food companies and is a sought-after expert who works with a variety of media outlets to help translate nutrition research into results. With that, I now welcome Dr. Slavin. Joanne, over to you.
Thanks, Kathy. I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate all the people that have tuned in, including some of my former students. So I'm expecting some tough questions, so appreciate you guys being on board today. So I want to talk first about the purpose of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. They are designed for professionals to help all individuals ages 2 years and older consume a healthy, adequate diet and to develop food, nutrition, and health policies and programs for the U.S. Picture of the new Dietary Guidelines is given there. So I want you to appreciate the large scope of the Dietary Guidelines. They have to include everybody ages 2 and above. So if you look, it is really the cornerstone of U.S. nutrition policy and regulations. So often people say, well, nobody's ever heard of the Dietary Guidelines. Who cares? It's not very important, but actually it has huge impacts throughout the U.S. and the world. If you look up on the top of the slide here, you see how the Dietary Guidelines have changed over the years, and they really haven't changed a ton. Most of even from 1980, you'll see some of the things that we're going to talk about today have gone forward. A couple of interesting things have happened along the way in 2005 where the whole grain recommendation of 3 or more servings came through, and that also is reflected in policy. If you look down across the bottom of the slide here, first of all, labeling, food labeling, changes that are happening right now on the food labels are based on the Dietary Guidelines. All the regulations for school lunch, the WIC program, the USDA nutrition programs are influenced by the Dietary Guidelines. The Federal Trade Commission, marketing, advertising, rules within those divisions are also influenced by the Dietary Guidelines. And then just throughout the world, they are the U.S. Dietary Guidelines, but other countries do not have the ability to come up with their own Dietary Guidelines. So a lot of them will look at the U.S. Dietary Guidelines as the best way of moving forward on policy. So they have huge impact, despite what a lot of people say. I want to talk about the science behind the guidelines because I was privileged to be on the 2010 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, which is a scientific committee that advises the government to come up with the dietary guidelines. So when you're on that committee, where do you come up with the information? Where's the science? And if you look, first of all, the committee does original systematic scientific reviews. So for all the questions, and the nice thing about the dietary guidelines, it's a very open process. You can send in questions. You can suggest topics that you think should be covered, and the committee will do an original systematic review of that. Also, they use other published systematic reviews, meta-analyses, other scientific reports. They look at dietary data analyses and come up with conclusions based on that. And then something I think people don't recognize much is just food pattern modeling. So what they can do is if we change something, if there's a recommendation, how does that affect the food supply? How does that affect nutrients? And then after the dietary guidelines meets, for about 2 years before the dietary guidelines are actually come out, they issue this technical report, and then the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Agriculture use that technical report as the background for the updated dietary guidelines. So if you go over on the right there, it shows you that it's not a real linear process. That's one way to get that information, but we have to make sure the dietary reference intakes, all the nutrients are provided with that recommendations. We mentioned the systematic reviews, diet modeling to help serve as a scientific basis for the dietary guidelines. So there's a little bit of controversy this year in what's happening with future dietary guidelines. This is really the first time there was so much controversy about the dietary guidelines. And I think part of that was that the scope of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee this year included topics like sustainability and taxation policies. And those were considered outside the scope of the dietary guidelines. And because of that, there have been congressional hearings on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory process. And so right now USDA and Health and Human Services are holding listening sessions to respond to this congressional request to only make dietary recommendations when the relationship between dietary exposure and health outcome is strong. This is actually a bit of a problem because a lot of the things we know in nutrition are more in the moderate rather than the strong relationship. And also the National Academy of Medicine, formerly the Institute of Medicine, committee is supposed to do a review of the whole dietary guidelines process and the composition of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. So I think you're going to hear more about that. The other thing that's really important is that the 2020 dietary guidelines are going to include from birth to 24 months. So that's going to be more challenges to make sure that that scientific base is as good as it can be. So what happened? And this is where people are like, why all this controversy? There really wasn't that many changes, but there actually are a few that I want to make sure we highlight here. There are 5 overarching guidelines for the 2015 dietary guidelines. Follow a healthy eating pattern across the lifespan. Focus on variety, nutrient density, and amount. Limit your calories from added sugars and saturated fats and reduce sodium intake. Shift to healthier food and beverage choices. And number 5, support healthy eating patterns for all. So what is a healthy pattern? A variety of vegetables, fruits, especially whole fruits, grains, at least half of which are whole grains, fat-free, low-fat dairy, including milk and yogurt, a variety of protein foods, and oils. And a healthy pattern limits saturated fat, less than 10% of your calories per day, trans fat as low as possible, added sugars less than 10% of your calories per day, and sodium less than 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day. And shift from individual foods and ingredients to healthy eating patterns really was the big focus on the dietary guidelines to make sure people eat with healthy dietary patterns. So what is that? What are we going to recommend in those patterns? So we'll go through those. First of all, you're sitting there, I'm sure, thinking, well, what's new here? Well, there's a lot of things that aren't new here because we haven't made a lot of progress. One would be vegetables and fruits. What's the recommendation? 2.5 cups of vegetables and 2 cups of fruits daily, and intakes remain significantly below recommended amounts. So in the vegetable category, 87% are not getting to the goal, and for the fruit, 75% are not getting to the goal. So what's changed since 2010? It's very similar. Vegetables, eating a variety of vegetables from all of the subgroups, and then fruit, especially whole fruit, as recommendations. So I know you have challenges within your facility too to get to those recommendations, but front and center, vegetables and fruits being promoted. A healthy pattern includes grains. So what's the recommendation? At least half of grain intake should be whole grain. And this is important because what we find is people still have not really, I said since 2005 that's been part of the dietary guidelines, but we're still seeing we don't get half of our grains as whole grains. Also, the importance of enriched and fortified grains as an important source of folic acid, making sure we get that. So what's the recommendation with the dietary guidelines? 6-ounce equivalents of grain foods per day. At least 3 of these, or half, should be whole grains. What's different? Well, similar to 2010, same recommendation. Half should be whole grains. But one of the advantages of 2015, one of the things that did happen, is they actually did a better job of defining what is a whole grain serving. So 16 grams of whole grain would actually count as one whole grain serving, and that's progress because before we just didn't have good ways of saying, are we making progress towards that goal? And this acknowledgement that a lot of whole grains are not particularly high in fiber. So they help get us fiber, but things like brown rice are not particularly high in fiber, but we still want you to eat those. And how did they come up with this recommendation? Systematic reviews and modeling as the basis for this recommendation. A healthy pattern also includes dairy. So what's the recommendation? 3 cups for ages 9 and above. Choosing fat-free or low-fat dairy, including milk, yogurt, cheese, and or fortified soy beverages. Pretty much everybody doesn't make the dairy recommendation, so we haven't made a ton of progress there either. Similar to 2010, 2 cups for ages 2 to 3, 2.5 for 4 to 8, 3 cups for ages 3. Choose fat-free or low-fat dairy products. And I want to mention here that whenever you get into the scientific basis, people will argue, well, full fat has similar good links to positive health outcomes, but the reason we are recommending low-fat is because of nutrient density, to take calories out of the diet. Things that are different from 2010, choose fat-free and low-fat dairy options with little or no added sugars, and we'll talk more about that. Choose milk and yogurt over cheese to reduce sodium, saturated fat, and sodium, both of those. Scientific basis for this, systematic reviews, and modeling. Protein. I feel really pleased about this one because in 2010 I kind of insisted that protein become part of the dietary guidelines because I think it is the most important. What's the recommendation? In the 2015, 5.5 ounce equivalents per day from a variety of plant and animal sources. The recommendation, we want you to vary the source: seafood, lean meats, poultry, eggs, legumes, nuts, seeds, soy. So make it clear that you can get it from both animal and plant sources, and variety is key. Average intakes are close to recommended amounts, and this is why protein never becomes a shortfall nutrient, and we probably don't emphasize it enough in my opinion. But there are a lot of people that are at risk. Protein food intakes decline in adults older than 71. So a lot of people, older people, do not get enough protein foods, and so we need to consider that and make sure that we make a particular emphasis on getting it there. And protein isn't a shortfall, but within these targeted people that aren't getting enough, absolutely we need to increase it. So what's changed since 2010? It's a similar recommendation. There is a little bit of lowered intake of processed meat or poultry, and a lot of this has to do with sodium and saturated fat issues. Where do we get our scientific basis of this? From the DRIs and from modeling. Oils. And I think so often people say, what about oils? Why is this? And this is because of the way that diets are put together for USDA and this patterning. So the recommendation is 5 teaspoons per day for a 2,000 calorie diet, shifting from solid fats to liquid oils. And this is important because some of the healthier oils we think of, things like nuts, fatty fish, have other nutrients that come along with them. Part of a healthy eating pattern is a major source of essential fatty acids and vitamin E, which is typically a shortfall nutrient. In general, recommendations are below what they should be within this category, so getting more intake of nuts, fatty fish is the recommendation rather than supplementing oils just by themselves. The recommendation similar to 2010. So those are the things we want people to get. What do we want people to limit? So we're going to go through some of the limitations here, things that will sound pretty familiar to you. A healthy pattern limits saturated, trans, solid fats, and cholesterol. And this has been very controversial because it seemed like, okay, if cholesterol is not limited, why is saturated fat? And remember, overall we need people to eat fewer calories, so there's going to be limits on fat. Less than 10% of calories per day from saturated fat. Current intake's about 11, so it's not too far off where it should be. Keep trans fat intake as low as possible. If you go over to the right, though, in the green, I think this has got most of the coverage. People are like, no limits on cholesterol. Go ahead, bacon, butter, go for it. And this was based on the scientific review, and that cholesterol, dietary cholesterol, doesn't seem to be a risk factor. So the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee said we don't recommend that 300 milligrams of cholesterol continue forward. So that has been removed from the dietary guidelines, but there's no reason to overdo cholesterol intake. It's just not part of the dietary guidelines anymore. Why this is important, reduction strategies do impact all food groups, and natural sources of trans fats don't need to be eliminated, but low-fat dairy and lean meats are encouraged to reduce intake of saturated fats. So this is the trans fat thing. There are trans fats in our food supply. We want to get that as low as possible. There's lots of controversy on what's a healthy fat, and I'm sure that you've heard from others that coconut oil is a healthy fat because there's been so much media interest, but it's still a saturated fat. It's a solid fat. So in this category, we want to get that down to 10% of our calories or less. This one is probably, besides cholesterol, this is the one that's got the other most interest from people. What is the recommendation for added sugar? Less than 10% of calories per day from added sugar. Where are we right now? About 13%, or about 270 calories per day. This is where we run into problems because nutrient-dense foods with added sugars are okay within limits. So things like fat-free yogurt, whole grain breakfast cereals, we don't want people to exclude those from their diet just because of the added sugar. So what's different from 2010? It's similar. 2010 we said reduce added sugar consumption, but this is the first time where there's actually a quantitative number. So this 10% of added sugar was in the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report, and that is a kind of a game changer. What's the scientific basis here? And this has created a lot of controversy. The World Health Organization has a systematic review which was used as the scientific background. They also did some modeling, but there was an acknowledgement that the scientific basis for this 10% is a little weak. So it will not have a strong recommendation similar to what people are asking for before recommendations are made. Where do you get added sugar? So often people think, well, it's all in pop, so get rid of pop. And obviously sugar-sweetened beverages are an important source. So if you look at this pie chart that is from the Dietary Guidelines report, the beverages take about 47%. And this includes soft drinks, fruit drinks, sport drinks, any of those. But also coffee and tea where people add sugar. Snacks and sweets are 31%. But the concern is things like grains and dairy are very small percentages of added sugars, and those contain important nutrients and are underconsumed, especially whole grains. So in trying to get added sugars out, we don't want to have unintended consequences of bad changes in our diet. Sodium, similar, 2,300 milligrams per day if your age is 14 or more. Current intakes are significantly more than that, and obviously we care because sodium is linked to high blood pressure. Similar to 2010, some of the recommendations, if you have hypertension, 15, but the subgroups that were in the 2010 have been removed. So that the dietary guidelines are really supposed to be for healthy people, so that is no longer part of it. The dietary reference intakes are the scientific basis and systematic reviews. So a little bit on nutrients of concern and the role of fortified foods. Obviously, it would be great if we could get people to eat according to the dietary guidelines and they would get all the nutrients. But if we look at where are we at, where are we actually deficient in nutrients, So much the dietary guidelines came out on diets and whole foods rather than nutrients, but we still have to make sure that our recommendations get those nutrients in. And here are the same nutrients of concern that we've seen: calcium, potassium, fiber, vitamin D. And so other people were concerned about women that are capable of becoming pregnant. Iron is a shortfall nutrient, and women also capable of becoming pregnant, folic acid, and kids also iron. So making sure that our dietary recommendations get that. Nutrients underconsumed, and this is for different groups, but potassium, fiber, choline, magnesium, calcium, vitamins A, C, D, and E. So we can't get away from nutrients. Got to make sure that our dietary patterns that we recommend cover those. Changes from 2010 shift to eating more vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and dairy to increase nutrients of concern. Why is it important? Because some of the important foods where people get these nutrients, fortified breakfast cereals and yogurt, were identified by the committee as key foods that provide these nutrients of concern. And also, without fortified foods and supplements, sometimes people cannot get the nutrients they need. So rather than saying we're not going to use any fortified foods, a lot of times it's much better to get those nutrients in that way. So we have a poll question. As you've listened to this, which new aspect of the guidelines will help most in your facility? So giving some more definition, what is an ounce equivalent of whole grains? So that would help you make that. Limits on added sugar, getting rid of cholesterol, or none of these affect you at all. So I'm watching your responses come in here. You guys are really fast on the trigger. I'm very impressed. It's coming down to the wire here. Boy, you guys are voting pretty darn equal. All right. I would say, obviously, all of these pretty equal as far as helping out or being effective or affecting what goes on in your facility, but I think the limits on added sugar is the one that's going to win out. But still, for a lot of people, getting rid of cholesterol will make some changes for them too. So here is the bar graph showing you that each of these will have some effect on your facility. So I want you to, hopefully I've inspired you to find out more about the dietary guidelines. So the nice thing about it, it's very available for you. The full report on the dietary guidelines is online. You can go into that website right there, and you can actually print out a copy of the dietary guidelines for Americans. The picture is shown there, and it will summarize what we've gone through today in the webinar. And also, if you want to ask any of the questions, go in. The whole Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report is available also for people for their reading pleasure. So you can go at that too. So I have the pleasure of introducing Chris, you've already heard from Kathy, but he's going to give you some information on applying the dietary guidelines to your practice, helping the public shift to healthy eating patterns. So take it away, Chris.
All right, thank you, Joanne. I love that information about the updated dietary guidelines, and it's certainly so useful for all of us. So, as Joanne mentioned, I want to talk about looking at some of the application within your facilities of what she had just touched on. So, let's just recap very quickly. First of all, the shift to more fruits and vegetables, and the basic recommendation: 2.5 cups of vegetables, 2 cups of fruit daily. And as we all know, Americans are unfortunately still not getting enough. Last I saw, about 11% of the population is actually hitting the recommendation, which, in other words, doing the math, about 89% or so are not quite hitting what we need to with the fruits and vegetables recommendations. So the question is then, how do we actually apply this? Well, certainly think about small shifts. Whenever I'm talking to my clients, patients, I'm always talking about small shifts because a lot of times people get overwhelmed with these recommendations and with all these changes, and people are very confused in terms of what to do with their diet. But what small shifts can be made to help folks make those changes? One, I always touch on and recommend, obviously fresh can work. We all know that. But a lot of people are confused, frozen, canned, and those certainly work, especially within your facilities where maybe some additions in recipes. Some patients may not even notice a flavor change. So frozen or canned can certainly work. Of course, like I said, we all know fresh works as well. Certainly thinking about fruits and vegetables as snacks, dips, or including dips for dipping, because anytime food is fun, whether it's adults or kids, that is certainly enjoyable. And then, as I mentioned, maybe hiding it in recipes to make sure that we add them in wherever we can. But the other piece with frozen and canned is they're economical. So that's another piece for a lot of people that's really, really important when we're thinking about making these changes. Now, as Joanne mentioned, also looking at making at least half of the grain intake from whole grains. So certainly shifting to more whole grains, not necessarily adding more overall. And I think that's an important piece to all of this when we're talking to clients, to patients, is it's not necessarily adding what Joanne had talked about. What are these shifts in the dietary guidelines? But it's a shift. It's a substitute. So shifting, transitioning some of the grains that we're eating into whole grains. Same with all the other nutrients that we'll touch on. It's swapping out one for another sometimes. So how do you actually apply this? Because I think people are very, very confused on the actual what is a whole grain. Well, number one, look for the word whole grain on the ingredient list. Also, look for the whole grain stamp, which you can see an image of it right there in the slide. That makes it very, very simple for folks. And then also seeking at least 8 grams of whole grain per serving. Now, one thing that's confusing for a lot of people, there's some words that are often used, things like multigrain or wheat, that aren't necessarily whole grain. Those words are in there because they're more, not to say they're marketing terms, but they confuse consumers a lot of times, thinking they are whole grains because it's not white flour. So keep that in mind when talking to patients and clients. It's certainly not all or nothing. It doesn't have to be, a lot of times people will say to me, whole grain pancakes, for example, don't taste the same, or whole grain pasta. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can mix and match and substitute maybe half the whole grains within a recipe. For example, adding half whole grain flour instead of just all white flour, for example. Same thing with soups and stews and casseroles. Certainly can add whole grains in there in some component. Of course, vegetables also work as well. Frozen veggies, as we had just touched on, or even canned veggies can work as well. In terms of the dairy piece to the puzzle, shifting to more fat-free or low-fat dairy. So the recommendation is 3 cups per day for those who are 9 and over. Again, going back to what Joanne had mentioned, choosing fat-free or low-fat versions. And that is necessarily, so we're not adding calories, but we're still getting the nutrients. And that's an important consideration, is that the only nutrients that change when you go to low-fat or fat-free are the fat and the calories. But the calcium, the protein, the potassium, all the other nutrients within the dairy products stay the same. And a lot of people are not aware of that. So, again, look at how can we include milk or other dairy options at meals. Certainly many options there. Maybe it's, replacing the soft drinks at the table, for example. Joanne had showed the sugar slide and showed that soft drinks were one of the highest source of sugar in the diet. Well, that's a great, easy substitution. Certainly losing the fear of lactose. A lot of times people are concerned about this sugar that's in dairy products. But one, if a patient is affected, has lactose intolerance, there are lactose-free or dairy alternatives for them. Again, using that word small shifts. This is an important piece. I mentioned maybe substituting soft drinks with dairy, for example. That doesn't necessarily mean, one day we come in and we eliminate 100% of the soda from a person's diet and replace it all with milk. That would be great in the long run, but probably not a realistic solution overnight. And then lastly, the choice of dairy should fit into the daily recommendations for calories, saturated fat, and of course added sugar as well. And I keep using milk, but we also need to think about yogurt, fat-free yogurt, great addition to breakfast, for example, or low-fat yogurt. Things along those lines add a great source of many, many nutrients that should certainly be included in people's diets. In terms of the protein, so Joanne mentioned the overall intakes are currently adequate when you look at the existing research. Our protein intake falls within the guidelines, and that is 5.5 ounce equivalents per day. Certainly emphasizing lean meats and also plant-based sources. And one thing that's nice is that we get a variety of sources of protein in the American diet. So we get a variety of amino acids from eating beef and fish and chicken, beans, tofu, nuts, all the different sources of protein in the diet. Now, one thing that's important, so as I mentioned, and Joanne had mentioned as well, the overall intakes are currently adequate. However, there's some interesting data, especially in older individuals, suggesting that we may necessarily, while we're getting enough protein, we may not be eating it at the right time. So one thing to think about in your facilities with your patients is to maybe emphasize more protein in the morning. And the reason that's important is because as we age, we start to lose muscle. We can start to lose muscle mass. Well, one way to help change that, of course, in addition to exercise, is adding more protein in the morning. So it's not necessarily that we are eating enough when you look at the guidelines, but a lot of research is now suggesting that we might need to add more and going back to shifting the intake. So more heavy protein in the morning and maybe lightening it up at dinner depending on what a person's eating, because most people eat very little protein in the morning and a lot of protein in the evening. And that's where a lot of the protein research is shifting right now. So again, looking at some more applications, again, you see the term small shifts. So also within those small shifts is maybe looking at a little bit more in the seafood department, because we know that fish also provides a great amount of other nutrients outside of just protein, things like omega-3s, for example, a very, very healthy fat. So using the term shifts again, it's maybe shifting a couple times a week, adding seafood in there, in casseroles and stews and other options as well. Certainly play around with plant-based proteins. We know that plant-based proteins provide a great amount of nutrients as well. In addition to protein, you get a little more fiber and some other nutrients also. So mixing and matching to provide the variety. Processed meats should fit within the overall recommendations for calories, saturated fat, sodium, added sugars. And then one thing, thinking about your clientele and the facilities you may work in, sometimes some of those processed meats, some other foods, may be softer, easier to chew meals, and protein or meats and protein sources are an important option as well. But making sure we get that protein consistently throughout the day is very, very important. Like I said, most people, especially older individuals, seems to be eating a lot less in the morning and a lot more in the evening, and that's not optimizing protein when we think about maintaining muscle mass. In terms of looking at the oil recommendation, the fat recommendation as a whole, so the recommendation is 5 teaspoons of oil a day. And once again, looking at some healthier sources of oil, things like olive oil and canola oil. Certainly looking at, shifting from solid fat, so replacing things like butter or shortening, for example, with some of the vegetable oils I had just mentioned is a much better alternative. And once again, this is a shift, a substitute, not necessarily adding. So a lot of times when we hear some of the recommendations, or I shouldn't even say recommendations, but some of the popular media, sometimes we hear things like fat is very, very healthy when you choose the right types, and we need to eat more of the healthier options. Joanne had mentioned coconut oil, for example. Olive oil is another one that gets a lot of great attention. And there are some solid data when we look at the Mediterranean diets and things like olive oil and canola oil. That doesn't necessarily mean we need to start adding those oils to our diet, but as I said, it's shifting from those solid fats, from the less healthy fats, the butters and the shortenings, etc., and shifting the healthier olive oils and canola oils. There still is a recommendation because while we do need certain fats for sure in terms of the nutrients we get, they still provide a significant amount of calories. And whether that is olive oil, coconut oil, butter, shortening, it doesn't matter what the source of fat is, they all provide the same amount of calories. So we need to keep that in mind as well. And that's where that recommendation, the recap is looking at about 5 teaspoons per day total. And then also looking at that second, in terms of the application, the second bullet, replacing some meat and poultry, things with some nuts and seeds and other healthy foods as well, because, again, we get some other great nutrients in addition to some of the healthier fats and oils within foods like nuts and seeds, etc. Now, looking a little bit beyond food groups, as Joanne had mentioned, I think it's important that one of the pieces of the dietary guidelines, they're shifting away from ingredients now and looking at an overall diet, and that's important because I always say we eat foods, we don't eat ingredients, so not looking at specifically just sugar or saturated fat or sodium. There's certainly some pieces to the puzzle that we need to eliminate some of those or reduce some of those, I should say. And here are looking at a few of those things like saturated fat, some of the common sources, meats, cheeses, sweets, mixed dishes, things like casseroles, pizza, etc. Well, look at some simple shifts below there. Think about how you can apply this within your facility or within your patients and encourage them to make, substituting low-fat or fat-free cheeses in mixed dishes. Okay, it doesn't necessarily change the nutrition or the nutrients, I should say. It just lowers the calories and lowers the fat. Also important is that wouldn't change the flavor because there's other ingredients in there to give that flavor. So therefore, patients wouldn't necessarily be concerned with a change in flavor. Certainly looking at trimming portion sizes of red meat or full-fat cheeses. Okay, not eliminating them, but reducing those portions. On the sodium side, breads, cheeses, mixed dishes, restaurant foods, certainly we get a lot of sodium. It all adds up throughout the diet. Well, looking at lower sodium varieties. Certainly adding that bulk from fresh or frozen vegetables and mixed dishes can certainly help. And then, of course, that also adds to what I talked about in the beginning, is that adds to the vegetable and fruit recommendation when we start adding bulk within those foods. It has two wins. One, it provides more nutrients from the vegetable itself. Two, it can help lower the sodium. So it's a win-win for our patients. Can I have someone shift to the next slide, please? Thank you. So we have a poll here, just like Joanne did. I'm going to also have another poll. So my question is, how do you communicate healthy eating messages most often? And you could choose as many as apply here. So a few different options. You're going to check as you think this applies to you. One-on-one counseling, group classes, staff in-service trainings, media and social media, or none of those. So go ahead and answer that poll. We'll wait about 30 seconds or so. Well, those answers are rolling in fast. Looks like, unlike Joanne's, we have a clear leader, but I will keep on paying attention because they're still rolling in there. All right. And looks like the majority of folks here would actually, as you see, about 75%, the responses would actually communicate those healthy eating messages through one-on-one counseling, which is great. Obviously, group as well is good as well. But look at this. So most folks working in the one-on-one counseling with patients, and I think that's great because then it gives you a lot more of that hands-on with the patients when we're talking about some of this. But then certainly staffing in-service trainings. Certainly there are a lot of folks will do that as well. But whatever works for you, whatever that communication method is obviously works, and that is how you're going to apply this information, which is really, really important. Every little bit of information helps. All right. And then the other piece that I wanted to touch on here, certainly when we look at obviously the dietary guidelines, people think of it in terms of food. But I always think about food and exercise as a bicycle, two wheels on a bicycle. Can't have one without the other. The bike's not going to run very well. So we certainly need to look at physical activity as well. And basically, I'm not going to go into depth on this, but meeting the physical activity guidelines for Americans, there are certainly some recommendations within there. In addition to following a healthy eating pattern, regular physical activity is one of the most important things Americans can do to improve their health. And I'll just say one more recent statistic that I was reading from a study is that, one thing that we know is that anything is better than nothing. That's really, really important to remind patients of that message. But the other piece to it is there's a study done fairly recently at the University of Pittsburgh. Actually, it was my former PhD advisor who did this study. But what they found was when they encouraged people to exercise or to move for at least 10 minutes, they found that on average, they not only did that 10 minutes, but they actually got about 17 minutes of movement. So again, when they were encouraged to do at least 10 minutes, they actually got at least 17 minutes of movement in, which is encouraging, almost double of what their recommendation was. So think about that. Remind patients, again, anything is better than nothing, and maybe getting that little bit of 10 minutes may actually add up even faster than you think. So how do we put these dietary guidelines into action? We all know everyone has a role in helping create and support these healthy eating patterns in multiple settings, home to school, one-on-one counseling, it doesn't matter. But there's lots of different resources within the dietary guidelines. Certainly MyPlate and ChooseMyPlate.gov are two great resources to make the application very, very simple. And again, specifically, there's a specific call out as you see the website, ChooseMyPlate.gov, and then /older adults for that population. Talking about and reviewing a lot of what Joanne and I had just touched on. Here are a few images of some of the resources that are in there, looking at healthy eating after 50, again, choosing healthy meals as you get older. So it really makes a lot of this very, very simple. I love, in particular, the what's on your plate, the various images, and again, people learn from a variety of different sources, as we know. So as I mentioned in my poll, as you responded, I should say, most folks are going to looking at that one-on-one counseling. So lots of very simple, easy handouts and tools to use and strategies with your own patients and clients. So that being said, we're going to take some questions. I'd love to turn it back over to Kathy and thank everybody for listening today.
Thanks so much, Joanne and Chris. These were really, really great presentations. So now we will have our question and answer segment of the webinar, and we've already received several questions during the presentations. So you can continue to submit questions by typing them into that lower left-hand corner of the conference webinar screen. I'll be reading the questions out loud, and then Chris and or Joanne will be responding so that everyone can hear them. So let's get started. This could be for both of you. What strategies can I offer my patients who are reducing or eliminating grains from their diet to help them understand the important role that grains, including whole grains, play? And then there's also a question around how do we help consumers identify how much whole grain is in a product or food if it doesn't carry the stamp?
Well, I can't resist a whole grain question, Kathy. You know that, so I got to jump in here. So I think it's really discouraging that so many people are cutting back on grains and cutting back on grains. So grains are an important source of so many nutrients, especially minerals, but and then whole grains obviously have more. So the recommendation of the dietary guidelines is make sure people get the recommended servings from the grain category. So I would, obviously there are gluten intolerances and there are issues, so if people have a reason, we can come up with other diets. But the average person really needs to include grains and try to get those whole grains into their diet. It's nice we have a recommendation that the 16 grams is a serving, so it gives us something to build on. Generally, I agree with the question that the person said it would be nice to have the stamp. That's one way of looking at whole grains, but it's not on all products. The way FDA thinks about it, as long as it's truthful and not misleading, that's what you need. So a lot of products will just say this contains this many grams of whole grain, and I think you can build from that. So as there's more interest in whole grains, I think you'll see more labeling of whole grains and also just whole grains going into more products. So, a lot of times as dietitians, we don't like to promote snack foods, but a lot of times that's a good way to get whole grains into the diet. Cookies, oatmeal cookies, so whole wheat bread. We have to be creative and get whole grains throughout the day. So just not thinking that we've made a ton of progress there. There's a lot of work to do to get the 3 servings of whole grains, so we got to keep at it.
Thanks,
absolutely. And yeah, to be honest, I can't do any more justice than that. So great answer for sure, and keep on adding those whole grains and including them.
Thank you both. So another question around added sugar. What's an easy way to guide our clients toward using or identifying ways to get 10% added sugar recommendation into their diet?
Boy, I will jump on that, even though I sometimes like to stay away from that one. Whole grains is a nice, safer place to be. But I think it's going to be interesting once we get the labels if FDA goes down that route, because it's going to be really difficult to get 10% of calories. And I think I've been watching some of the questions come in, and it's absolutely a concern that when we lower fat, then we add sugar because people like the flavor. So try to get at that balance point is important. Obviously, there's lots of foods, especially in that beverage category and the dessert category, that they're all way beyond 10% of calories from added sugar. So if you look at the overall diet, you have to look at it that way. And my concern is with this new recommendation is that things like whole grain cereals and yogurt, people are going to look and say, oh, we have to be below this number of grams, and that will take some important things out of the food supply. Chocolate milk is another example that so often when we have low-fat dairy, we put more sugar in so it tastes better. So to say, okay, we can only have this many grams of added sugar or we're not going to consume the food, that's going to take some important foods out of our food supply. So it'll be interesting to see how the added sugar recommendation goes forward, but my concern is the unintended consequences. We want to do good to take added sugar out, but we don't want to take out the recommended foods that we've talked about today, the whole grain foods and the dairy foods that are important sources of nutrients.
Anything to add on that, Chris?
No, I think the one piece potentially when we think about how can we add, and I talk to clients a lot about this, is how can we add sweetness without actually adding sugar? So maybe thinking about adding fruit to various foods, for example, can certainly do that. Certainly we get nutrients as well and get that added recommendation of more fruits. But I always try to do that, is try to add sweetness without actually adding sugar, so people can actually get at least close to that 10% of what's recommended for the added sugar.
Thank you. And there's a couple follow-up questions about artificial or alternative sweeteners and how they fit into the guidelines.
I've been really enjoying the chats and all the questions coming up. So I agree. This is the hard part, is that if you say, okay, we need to cut added sugar, then what do we replace it with? And Chris's point of, okay, fruit is underconsumed, so we can come up with some fruits. But a lot of times the sweet taste is what makes people take some of the foods in that like whole grains, oatmeal, even oatmeal, the average person is not going to eat it without some type of sweetener. So, I think if you go into the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report, there was the acceptance that alternative sweeteners give people options for sweetness without calories, and that they are safe. So there's this ability to promote those, but a lot of people do want to be more natural. So now you see even this total swing, which I never thought I would see, to natural sugar, that natural sugar is somehow better, or raw sugar, all these things. So some of the questions on the email, I really appreciate that we just keep going back and forth. So we go these huge swings, and we really need to stay in the middle. That our added sugar content right now is only 13%, and if even the recommendation of 10 is not a huge change, that we have to take it all out. So giving people permission that that if you're healthy, that there's a need for calories, and some of those can be sugar, and if you still can't have extra calories, then alternative sweeteners, and there's a wide range of them out there, are another tool to help people take in the foods that we're trying to get them to consume.
Thank you. And Chris, anything to add to that?
No, agree with everything Joanne had said.
Okay. So we've had several questions actually about the role of milk alternatives such as almond, soy, cashew milk, and how do those products fit into the dietary guidelines?
Well, I will start. I'm sorry. I just can't get away from this one because I find you have to look at the label. Milk, besides the fact it is the important source of calcium and vitamin D, also provides 8 grams of high-quality protein per serving. So if people are switching that up with some alternative milk, they got to make sure they read the label and make sure that those nutrients are still coming along. And most of the ones I've seen do not provide that. You see the recommendations on soy milk, and if you're going to substitute soy milk, make sure that the nutrients that are supposed to come along with the dairy group actually come along with those products. And some of our discussion earlier on fortified foods is part of that solution. If we're going to take alternative foods and use those as a substitute for those groups, we got to make sure that we're not going to create more shortfall nutrients. So those are the key ones that I'm concerned about in these kinds of switches. And it's the same thing we get with grains. People avoid the grain group, and then there's all these nutrient deficiencies. They avoid the dairy group, switch over to something else, and actually create nutrient deficiencies. And so there's a definite concern there.
And the other piece I'll add to that, certainly the protein piece, with if it's not dairy or soy, the other piece is that a lot of these milks, whether it's cashew, almond, hemp, flax, there's lots of them out there now, a lot of them have added sugar, a good amount of added sugars. So obviously we just had that discussion. If we're looking at trying to get our added sugar intake down, and these are essentially flavored with sugar, pretty much no protein at all. So that's another piece to the puzzle when we're looking at some of those dairy alternatives.
Great, thank you. We are having great questions coming in, so please keep them coming. But here's one. Would like to get a little more clarification around the 5.5 ounces of protein and whether or not that is adequate for the older population. And also, Chris, maybe if you could just address, there's been a couple follow-up questions around the protein in the morning piece. So just to move into that a little bit.
Yeah, certainly. So with the protein in the morning, so we don't store protein like we do other nutrients. We store carbohydrates, we store fat. But because we don't store protein, and we need protein, we need these amino acids from protein to help what's called protein synthesis, to help ultimately build muscle. Because we don't store it, your salmon dinner the night before isn't going to necessarily help you the next morning. So from what I've seen and talking to protein researchers, when you eat a high-quality protein, the amino acids within that protein last for essentially kind of peak around 2 hours after you eat that protein, approximately. So that being said, if they peak around 2 hours and then start to decline again, we need to have some consistent protein. Again, that includes the morning, because most people, as I had mentioned, are eating only around 10 to 12% of their overall protein is coming in the morning, and a majority of it is in the evening. So therefore, if they're not getting those amino acids necessary throughout the day, they're not giving their muscles what they need, that stimulus essentially, like exercise is the stimulus, but then the amino acids are necessary to help those muscles build, repair, and grow. So again, the key is that your salmon dinner the night before is not going to help you the next morning. So that's why one of the reasons it's so important to make sure we're getting protein consistently throughout the day.
Great. This is going to probably be our last question that I will give you now. Do you have advice on what to say to clients who insist that the total amount of fat doesn't matter as long as they choose healthier fats and don't overconsume calories? And also, would you clarify the role of coconut oil or where coconut oil fits into these recommendations?
So I'll start here. The piece with fat, from my perspective, is what if you're eating that much fat and the person said the calories are not changing, that means it's displacing something else. So maybe it's whole grains, maybe it's fruit. Who knows what it is. But if they're adding that fat in, and again their calories aren't changing as it said in the question, then somehow they're missing some other nutrients. Because when one thing goes up in the diet, something else has to go down. Calories are obviously your body weight staying the same. So that being said, fat certainly plays a role, and there's lots of healthier fats, but not in place of other nutrients, the whole grains, the lean protein, etc. And then in terms of the coconut oil, I know Joanne touched on this. I mentioned the term coconut oil a few times just because it is so popular. It's a saturated fat. It's not while there are some structural differences compared to other saturated fats, at the end of the day, it is a saturated fat. So the recommendation for saturated fat is about 10% or depending on which guidelines you look at, the 10% of the overall fat calories. So just blindly adding lots of coconut oil, which trust me, I've had clients do that because they hear it's good, isn't necessarily a great idea because it adds a significant amount of calories, let alone, of course, the saturated fat itself.
Anything to add, Joanne?
Nope, that sounds right.
Okay. Well, again, we're getting close to the end of our time, so I want to thank you both, Joanne and Chris, for offering your expertise today and for answering the questions. Any unanswered questions will be posted to an FAQ sheet on the General Mills Convenience and Food Service website. You will also be receiving a follow-up email with your CEU certificate along with a link to the webinar recording and presentation deck. Last but not least, we invite you to visit the BellInstitute.com website and register to be among the first to know when there are new nutrition education resources, coupons, scientific research, and free continuing education like the one you received today. I want to say a big thank you to all of our audience members for attending the webinar today. We appreciate your time and hope you have a wonderful week. This concludes today's program. You may now disconnect. Thanks again.